Generative AI is here, and it has changed the rules of the game. Experts like Seth Godin and Robert McKee have been very clear. The authors who are going to make it in this business are those who are writing truly amazing, knock your socks off innovative stories. The bar is that high. AI will replace mediocre writers. But at some point, everybody is mediocre. So what do? You educate yourself. And the good news is that there's still time, but you've got to start leveling up right away. I'm Valerie Francis, and I've got a series of webinars to help you do just that. My specialty is helping authors like you put theory into practice. Understanding the tools of our trade and being able to apply them with precision is no longer an option. It's an absolute necessity. So go to valeriefrancis.ca/webinars for more information and sign up for the notifications. You can't afford not to.
This week, we are going to look again at my favourite Bond movie, Skyfall. There's more subtext in this movie when compared to the usual Bond movies, and in my opinion, it serves the story well. Skyfall uses subtext to foreshadow, it shows character, there are gender roles in there, and there are overt and covert emotions, as well as stakes. And there is also a really good way that the subtext establishes a mother and her son's dynamic between Bond and Silver. So in this episode, I focus on that relationship triangle between Bond, M, and Silver in Skyfall. So for a Bond movie, there is more going on under the surface than we realise, and we can learn a lot from this old dog with its new tricks.
If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with those first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Skyfall so that we can study subtext. This 2012 film was directed by Sam Mendes from a screenplay by Neil Purvis, Robert Wade, and John Logan. And it's, of course, based on Ian Fleming's James Bond books. Now, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie unless we talk about the movie. But come on, it's James Bond. We know what's going to happen. And we would love it if you could leave the show a rating and review. That would make our day. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Scroll to the bottom of the landing page, and it's that simple. Just click some stars and you're done. Melanie, what do you have for the global genre of Skyfall?
Well, hopefully this will be pretty simple. But I've got action story, and I'm not saying it's a crime story because it's very clear who committed the crime, and the story turns into a cat and mouse game. And then for the secondary genre, I've got a very light maturation story, very superficial. What do you have?
I think it's an action story as well, specifically a James Bond action story, which is its own thing. To me, that's a whole subgenre of action. And for secondary genre, I have not applicable. because it's James Bond. And it's not that kind of story. We don't want James Bond to be some different guy at the end of the movie than he's at the beginning. Anyway, it's an action story.
Okay. Right. And I agree wholeheartely. And there is a lovely consistency. It's the same with Jack Reacher novels and a few others. So there are some stories where you don't want some sort of maturation or internal genre going on. Okay, so this week I'm looking at the subtext in relationships in Skyfall. And the question I've given myself to answer is, how does the subtext work between M and Raoul Silva and Bond and his connection with Skyfall, the place, not the movie? I'll also touch on some other examples of subtext, such as innuendo and euphemisms. and also how we should have picked up very early in the movie that M was going to die. So there's our first spoiler if you haven't seen it, if you haven't seen the film or know what's going to happen. So I grew up when Roger Moore was Bond, and my dad always talked about Bond movies as being completely unrealistic but still good fun. And he was right. But as a teenage girl, they did not offer aspirational female characters. And more recently, having read a few of Ian Fleming's Bond books, I don't believe they have aged well at all. However, when Judi Dench first appeared as M in 1995's GoldenEye, she tells Pierce Brosnan, who was Bond at the time, that she thinks he's a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War whose boyish charms are wasted on her. If you think that I don't have the balls to send a man out to die, your instincts are dead wrong. And we really sense a changing of the guard. Judi Dench's M relies on statistics and analysis rather than impulse and initiative, which puts her at odds with Bond's. And she was a woman I could relate to. Now, when Daniel Craig became Bond, the franchise got a reboot, and it changed the way Bond was presented. The writers modernised Bond and brought him into the new century. And you can really see this in the removal of a lot of the misogynistic elements of Bond, of the previous Bond stories. They are not as prevalent in the Daniel Craig stories, and the female characters are competent and not just in support roles. Now, in this episode, I'm going to focus on the relationship triangle between Bond, M, and Silver in Skyfall. And it's a good example of how to play off gender roles, stakes, and overt and covert feelings. And I'm going to point out highlights of certain scenes in the movie and then hopefully draw all these together to show how the relationships drive the action and the obvious and hidden ways that this is done. Now, in the opening sequence, we hear M tell Bond to stay task-focused and leave Ronson, who is an agent that's been shot. And Bond is there and sees him and wants to stop the bleeding. Now, Bond does what he's told and he leaves, and Tanner is then the one who organises a medevac. Bond is chasing, at this point, a stolen list of NATO agents who are embedded in terrorist organisations. Now, M is always looking at the bigger picture, and she will sacrifice one life to save many in most instances. However, in this scene, she always asks if 007 is all right. Moneypenny is in this sequence as well, setting up a shot that is not clean. We can see through her crosshair, so through her scope, and we see that Bond is right in the centre of, if she were to take the shot, it's most likely that she would hit him. Now, M is blind, but tells Moneypenny to take the shot anyway. She does, and the thief gets away, and Bond is hit and falls off a moving train that's on a high bridge. M then looks out the window but doesn't say anything. So just pause for a moment and consider if you think M is cold or if you think negatively of her after this sequence. Now, I'm not sure how realistic it is that M would be the one giving orders for a tactical operation directly, but it does tell us a great deal about her. And again, she is task-focused. She expects her agents to do their job and hit their targets. She also understands the risks and consequences of the game she's in. And most importantly, she is not motivated by sentiment or emotion. And she always keeps that larger picture at front of mind. And this is exactly what you'd expect from a professional who survived in a male-dominated environment and is at the top of her professional game. Now think about Bond. He's a 007. He's licensed to kill. He's an instrument of the government, and he lives on the edge of life and death all the time. He is the one who tries to save Ronson, and by doing this, he gives the thieves more time to get away. Now think about Moneypenny. She shows initiative with her driving and gets into a position where Bond is going to seemingly be killed. So she does appear to kill him, so it's blue on blue. What I'm trying to say here is there's all this subtext about roles and responsibilities, who's acting on emotion and who isn't. And this is really important for the movie, especially later on when we see how Silver reacts to M and what he calls her. Now, M, however, after all of this very clinical approach to the operation, is the one who sits down and writes Bond's obituary. So she does that personally. And what it does is imply that she takes his loss very personally as well, although you don't always see this when she's dealing or interacting with him. And as you'd expect from a movie like this, the action is front and centre of most scenes. However, there is a lot of unsaid emotion in the expressions of the actors and the small lines when they do check on each other. And these nuances are important because they signal the emotional dependence these characters have on each other. Even if it's not conscious, we do register it on some level. Now, the first interaction we see between M and Silver is when her computer is being hacked and he sends the message, "Think on your sins." Now, M has worked in MI6 for many years, and she probably has many, many sins, well, what we would consider sins. So, and at this point in the story, we are really wired to want to know, what does this mean? What does this message mean? We also suspect that the person sending these messages wants to taunt M. And when we see Silver in person or we meet him in the movie, we know that's exactly what he's doing. Now, as I'm going through the movie, you'll see what I'm doing, even though I don't provide a lot of description, but I'm moving through the movie sequentially. So at this stage, after M is in the car and gets that message, we then switch to Bond, who is alive, and he is hiding when he sees the MI6 headquarters blown up. And he's behaving in a very self-destructive way. So the implication that we take from that is he is very much ruled by his emotions. And is that where we want an agent, a 007, to be? Now, I would argue probably not. However, after the explosion, we then see M standing next to the coffins with the Union Jacks draped over them. We then understand that she does bear the responsibility for the loss of the MI6 staff, and she vows to find whoever killed them and get retribution. So she is moved to action by this act, which is in contrast to how she reacted when Bond was shot. At home, M and a born-again Bond come face to face. Her response to his arrival is very matter-of-fact, and Bond is very emotional by comparison. M states the obvious to him, or tells him the obvious thing, and she is right, that he should know the rules of the game because he's been playing it long enough. And Bond then suggests to her that they are both played out. Now, this phrase and the coming scenes between M and Mallory really set the ending up, and we start to become aware that M has a battle on her hands and that M could be on the way out, even if she doesn't want to go. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. So we're still in the apartment with M and Bond, and M does not give Bond a break when discussing his return to service. She tells him he has to pass the tests, and with typical English bluntness, she tells him what they did to his belongings after his death. So why does she do that? Well, we get the feeling that she's pleased to see him, otherwise she wouldn't let him back in. But M has reverted to type. She is task-focused and unsentimental. Now, if M was any other way with Bond, what would that signal? Valerie, did you want to jump in here and offer an opinion on what I've said so far?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way Silva is playing up this mother thing and the way M is behaving and how we're sort of expecting her to be more nurturing simply because she's a woman. But if she was, she wouldn't be doing her job. There's a reason she's in that job. If it wasn't Judi Dench, if it was a male actor, we wouldn't expect him to be emotional and fatherly, but we're so programmed because of the stories that we've been told and that we've been watching and we've been listening to forever and ever and ever. We're programmed to see a woman in a role and just naturally assume that she's going to be more emotional than a man in the role. And when she isn't, she seems colder than a man would in that role. But I see her as stoic. She's right. Bond should know the rules to the game because he has been in it a long time. He needs to be reminded that she was doing her job and doing it very well.
Well, it's interesting that he does need reminding, isn't it? Because I'm sure that he wouldn't need reminding if he did have a male boss. But yes, the fact that she has to remind him. And it's interesting because I think what that says is that maybe Bond actually wants her to be different, which I find interesting. And this is where, you could look at a Bond movie in a very superficial way, and it is an action movie, and there is absolutely very superficial parts of the story. But there is subtext going on in this story, and it's not something I think that we've really seen in Bond movies in the past, but it's very, as I was watching it and I was really paying attention to the relationships, I think Bond is being set up in this story to be a bit more childlike, and he does want a level of mothering from M. Right or wrong, that's what I think the story is setting him up to do. And it's a contrast, it's a device to contrast him as potentially a child and then the silver version of a child as well. So I think it's quite well done, and it's very surprising considering it's in a Bond movie. Anyway. But that's what I'm thinking. Now, I'm more than happy if people disagree with me, and maybe I am reading too much into it, but I've watched a lot of Bond movies, and this is the first one that I've really seen this kind of behaviour and this neediness from Bond. And I think the previous movies in the Daniel Craig version of Bond make this allowable, or it's not too much of a stretch. But anyway, Bond undergoes the test when he goes back to work, and he has to undergo a word association test, which is very interesting. So the psychologist says M, and Bond responds by calling her a bitch. And he knows that she's there. He knows that she's behind the two-way mirror or the one-way mirror, and that she's present. So he does it deliberately. So this is very unoriginal, I think, from a calling a professional woman a bitch. But Bond is acting like a petulant child with M. And it's important, like I sort of hinted at before, to ask yourself why. Then the psychologist moves on to say the word Skyfall, and then Bond walks away at the mention of Skyfall. Now, we'd expect an element of mystery in an action crime movie, and this is where this part of the movie, this mystery, is right there front and centre. It is plonked right in front of the viewer and you can't look away from it. And we also assume that M knows who or what Skyfall is, and that she could be testing him to see what his reaction is when the word is mentioned. We move on, and M tells Bond that he's passed his tests, even though he hasn't. So Mallory asks him why he came back and tells Bond being an operative is a young man's game. He also tells M that she's sentimental about Bond, which I think is actually quite a brave thing for Mallory to do. But M is sentimental towards Bond at that moment, and I think she demonstrates that by allowing him to return, even though she knows he hasn't passed any of his tests. And it's interesting then when we move on to Bond meeting the new Q, and they are looking at the painting Fighting Temeraire by Turner, which depicts an old warship being towed away for scrap. There are continuous references to age and relevance in Skyfall, and it's all directed at 007 and M. Now, Q is, of course, young, and when a young person talks about the inevitability of time, they aren't coming from a place of experience, even if they do understand the concept. So, in a way, it's insulting to have a young person talk about aging when you're older than them. And I think it's very deliberate. And again, this is setting things up, I think, for M to die at the end, but also highlight that Bond's not maybe far behind her. Now, the second attack on M's laptop is a link to the first 5 agents who Silver has publicly named. And then there's another reference to think on your sins. Now, at this point, M and Mallory watch the first 5 agents being executed. And Mallory tells M that she'll have to face an inquiry. Now, M knows that the person behind the plot is an operative or a former operative, but she's not saying who she suspects it is or even confirms if that's what she believes. But we very much get a feeling that she does know that. Now, at the same time as this scene is happening, Bond is meeting Silver. So Silver's first story is about the island his grandmother owned. So note the maternal reference there. Bond identifies Silver as an agent who worked for M in Hong Kong. And Silver then responds that back then I was her favourite. Silver goes on to undermine M to Bond, and he tells Bond how M lied to him, and he calls M mummy. And now we are getting to the crux of Silver's issue. He regards M as a mother figure. So Silver undoes Bond's shirt with homoerotic overtones, and Silver is clear that whatever he is doing is all about the 3 of them at this point in time. Now, Silver wants to get to M, and that's kindly delivered and that happens because Bond kindly delivers Silver's back to London, and M comes face to face with him. And he is very clear, Silver is very clear about how he saw her as a mother figure. And regardless of whatever her work was, she comes back and says that regret and remorse are unprofessional. Now, I think that's a very clunky line, and I'm not actually sure if M delivers that with any real conviction, but it's not surprising that that's what she puts forward and continues on as her presentation to the world. Now, Silver was tortured, and he protected M and her secrets. And then he's surprised that she feels no remorse. So he believes M betrayed him, and he has survived so that he could look her in the eye one more time and, we assume, kill her. But M is unrelenting, and she withdraws her recognition of him, which is the equivalent of withdrawing her affection. Now, Silver calls her mother and then shows her the impact of the cyanide, the impact the cyanide capsule has on his face. M looks away. Then later, just outside of that scene, M confesses to Bond that she knows exactly who Silver is and that she gave him up in return for 6 agents. And M always plays the larger game. She is not motherly at all. So I'll ask this question again. Is M cold? Or do you think negatively of her after watching the interaction with Silver and then her confession to Bond? Is it right for her agents to think she should act in a motherly way just because she's female? And I'm just asking them rhetorically because it plays into what Valerie was saying just before, that because she is female, you may expect different things from her, and when she doesn't act in that way you expect, it's easy to dismiss her as cold or a bitch. But the contrast is that if a man did those same things, would you have those same expectations? Another question I have is, what is the dynamic that the movie Skyfall is based on? And very simplistically, I think it's 2 children playing off against each other to win their mother's affection. Now, Bond's petulant behaviour at the beginning of the film establishes his anger towards M because she told Moneypenny to shoot him. And he hides out in a way to punish her. And also think back to the scene in M's house where she scolds Bond and lets him know that there were consequences for his action. And it's interesting because the next day, when Bond turns up for training, the first question he asks Tanner is, when can I see M? Now, M and Bond go it alone to face off against Silver. And this is where sentimentality does start to present itself. And we see that with Bond's Aston Martin, where they drive up to Scotland. When they get to Skyfall, we do see how barren Bond's life as a child was, and he was orphaned at a young age. And the implication is that M really is a mother figure to him, or a parental figure in some ways, because he was deprived of having parents at a very young age. Now, M has a moment of reflection where she believes that she has stuffed up the whole operation. And this time it's Bond who actually says to her that she was just doing her job. Now at Skyfall, but M is wounded in the ensuing gunfight before Silver arrives. And then when he does arrive, all he wants is M. Silver blows up the Aston Martin, and so he's sending a signal that he's there to destroy Bond. And then Bond blows up Skyfall. And if blasts are a representation of who owns the biggest bang, then I think Bond wins. Silver isn't worried about Bond. He just wants M, and he becomes very singularly focused at this point in time. And then when Silver enters the chapel and sees that M is hurt, his reaction initially is one of caring. And it's a very weird way, but he's a very weird character. And at that point, he then gets angry and then gives her a gun and asks her to release both of them, and then puts their head together and asks her to shoot them with one bullet at the same time. Now, James kills Silver then, and then he holds M, and she gives him some very hard-earned praise, and she dies in his arms. And then Bond cries. Now, I just want to say that again. Bond cries. So after M dies, Mallory becomes the new M. Now we have a man in charge. Now, don't get me wrong, Mallory is a fine M, but I just ask the question, will there be any suggestion of daddy issues in the relationship between Bond and Mallory in the remaining of Daniel Craig's Bond movies? Well, I've seen them all and there isn't. So that's interesting. Now, when I got to this point in the movie, I did ask myself a couple more questions. So if Mallory did what M did, would it have had the same impact on the movie? And I don't think so. Valerie, what do you think?
There were so many times I wanted to jump in here and say things. I'm like, no, just let her continue. Let her continue. Where to start? Yeah. What the heck was up with the crying? Let me just focus on that, because this is going to tie into something that I want to talk about later, because it made me think of the Kenneth Branagh version of the Agatha Christie movie we just did.
When we did was it Death on the Nile?
Death on the Nile,
yeah.
That's right. And how Poirot was crying. Well, that's not Poirot. This is not Bond. Yes, update the franchise. Absolutely. Like, I'm torn, right? Because these are not characters that, like, we don't sign on to watch a Bond movie to see Bond sobbing over M. That's not what we're there for. And we're not there to see M, because she's a woman, be maternal automatically and have the expectation that she must be maternal. Now, I might be going off on a tangent here. I don't know. That never stopped me before, so I'll just keep going. I know several women who, in the real world, who have chosen not to have children. And every single one of them have had a really hard time of it, because the people around them, society around them, make one of two assumptions: either that she's not able to have a child, or that there's something wrong with her because she doesn't want children. What's wrong with you that you don't like children? And in all the women I'm thinking about, neither of those two things are the case. But there's the absolute assumption that simply because you're a woman, you must be maternal. And many of us are. Yeah, that's true. But if we're going to evolve the franchise, this would be a good place to do it. And they certainly made a great start by having M as a woman, because that is a role that can be filled by a man or a woman, right? It's not a gender specific role. Q is another one, could be male or female, not gender specific. But I don't know. Like, I don't want to see Poirot crying, and I don't want to see James Bond crying. I think it's jumping the shark. Anyway, carry on.
I think so. But it's an interesting point, right? And it plays into this whole undertone and subtext about the mother-son relationships that I've picked up and pointed out as I was looking at this movie, and particularly focusing on the subtext. Right, so, and again, the dynamic between the three main characters in this movie is based on stereotypes. And I believe it's a good way to demonstrate a few things. So M needed to be a ball breaker in her role as the head of MI6. She was task-focused and understood the strategic game she was playing. And that's important, but we've now reverted back to a particular type of stereotype. Now, she doesn't break character. She still is a ball breaker to a certain degree, but there is this new facet of her personality that we potentially haven't seen before. Now, in this film, Bond and Silver are polar opposites, but both shaped by M, but with very different outcomes based on their own actions. You could argue that both Bond and Silver were cast aside by M for the sake of an outcome, but as M said to Bond, you know the rules of the game. And although M did not let her emotions show, we do know she cared for both Silver and Bond. She saw, but in a responsibility, I'll just add there that it's more about responsibility, as you would expect a leader to feel some sort of accountability and responsibility to the people who work for them. Now, we also saw M contemplate her loss and write Bond's obituary. Now, despite her facade while facing Silver, M did remember his name. She knew exactly who he was, but she took the same approach with Silver as she did with Bond, in that they both knew the rules of the game, and that there are consequences when things don't go well. Silver's actions put M in a position where she had to play the long game, and he was a casualty. There are some other really good examples of subtext in Skyfall, and euphemisms is really well shown in certain parts of the movie. And I just want to draw your attention to it because I think it's a really obvious and good example of how to use subtext. So a euphemism is a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. So when we see M meet with Mallory for the first time, we hear some excellent examples of euphemisms as a way to hide, but also a way to make clear about what really is going on. So here's an example. So Mallory says, "The Prime Minister is concerned." So what does he really mean? Well, here's how I interpret the subtext of that statement. He's telling M that the PM thinks she's failed and he's potentially going to be politically embarrassed. If this occurs, then she's likely to be the one thrown under the bus. Mallory then goes on to say, "Have you considered pulling out the agents?" M rightly replies, "I've considered every option." So what M is really telling Mallory is, "I know how to do my job." They then move into text and become blunt about the purpose of their meeting. Mallory and M continue, and she asks if their meeting is to be called civilian oversight. And he says, "No, we are to call this retirement planning." So Mallory is telling M that she's lost her job. And the euphemisms continue until M has had enough. So Mallory wields his euphemisms in other scenarios as well. And during M's questioning at the inquiry, after the minister has been speaking for some time, he asks or says, "Excuse me, Minister, I don't mean to interrupt, but for the sake of variety, might we actually hear from the witness?" And then what he's really saying is, "Can you please stop talking and let him have a word?" Now, there are also examples of innuendo, because it wouldn't be a Bond movie without innuendo. Now, Moneypenny and Bond continue the tradition of sexual tension that's carried through all of the Bond movies, but this time Moneypenny was the agent who shot Bond, and Bond lets Moneypenny know that she didn't hit any vital organs. Then Moneypenny turns up in Macau and gives Bond a close shave with a cutthroat razor. Moneypenny observes that it's an old-fashioned way of shaving, but sometimes the old ways are best. And Moneypenny has been sent to Macau to help in any way she can. And while literally that's true, there are also undertones of the tension between them. And then she does go on to support Bond in Macau, but there's still a lot of sexual tension in those words, even though it's not directly referenced in any way. Now, finally, M's death. And like I mentioned before, M's death is signalled early in the movie. Bond does this first when he tells her they are both played out. There's the interchange between Mallory and M in their first meeting, and he gives her a retirement date, and she says no. And then M's speech during the inquiry explains her position. It explains why she does what she does and her view of the world. Then she goes on to quote Tennyson's poem Ulysses, which is a dramatic monologue spoken by an elderly Ulysses reflecting on his life. The poem, amongst other things, says, "It is better to die trying to reclaim one's youthful bravery than to accept old age and live an idle, sheltered life." The poem provides us with insight into M's state of mind, and it is also a reminder to those in powerful positions that the work of MI6 is not for everyone, and there will always be agents that work in the shadows. This is where M is comfortable, and this is where she belongs. And like Ulysses, she belongs on the quest to find adventure and continue learning right up until the end. So that is my very long presentation about some of the subtext that is in Skyfall. Valerie, I'll hand over to you now to talk about the middle of the movie.
And now for something completely different. Okay, Skyfall is an arc plot story, but it's not a fully explored hero's journey form. Why do I say that? Well, the hero's journey is all about the change that takes place in the hero. It's a way of dramatizing how a person changes from the beginning of a story to the end of the story. And we've already talked about the fact that 007 doesn't change. That's not a criticism. It's not a slight. It's the way Bond is. It's what the audience wants. Now, this isn't just an action story. It's a James Bond action story. It has its own subgenre, in my opinion, with its own conventions. People watch Bond movies with very clear and deeply entrenched expectations. It's not a formula a writer or filmmaker is going to mess with lightly. We want James Bond to be James Bond. We're tuning in for great action scenes and fun gadgets. We're not tuning in to see James Bond deal with some great inner turmoil. And I mentioned this a little earlier, it's the same kind of deal with Agatha Christie mysteries, right? We want Poirot to be Poirot. We don't want him acting out of character. This is the problem that Branagh had and has in the films that he's making. He's reimagining Poirot, but his reimagining is more about him and the type of character he wants to portray, in my opinion, than they are about Poirot. And that's why I think they're stupid. Anyway, now, I have to be honest here, cards on the table. I'm not the biggest James Bond fan in the world. I don't dislike the movies, but I don't seek them out either. For me, one is pretty much the same as the next. So when I'm looking at this film from a writing perspective, I actually can be quite objective because I have no great opinion for this particular genre one way or the other. I really am on the fence on this one. And I have to say that all in all, I think the writers here have done quite a good job. There are so many Bond movies that it's hard to innovate. It's hard to give audiences something fresh. So what they've done here is go back to the basics, which in my opinion was a really good move. And what's more, they made the whole movie about going back to the basics. It's kind of the theme. In a world where everything is high tech and more films are about technology and cybercrime and fancy gadgets and all that kind of stuff, the spectacle that I keep talking about in so many movies, what this movie is doing is saying that none of that can replace the old-fashioned spy work. You still need someone out in the field to pull the trigger or not pull the trigger, as the case may be. So what they've done is strip 007 of all the fancy stuff. Yes, a Q is there, of course. He's a convention of the James Bond subgenre. So we do have Q giving him tools that he needs to triumph. Not only is it a convention of the Bond films, it's also a step in the hero's journey, just by the by. But he doesn't get much. He gets a gun that's programmed for his handprint and a radio. Fancy dancy little tiny radio, but it's still a radio. He doesn't even have his Aston Martin, as Melanie, as you were talking about earlier. He doesn't have that at the beginning. He doesn't have his apartment. He doesn't have his childhood home. He doesn't have the gun collection. He doesn't have any of it. All of those physical tools, physical gadgets, physical manifestations of what we think of when we think of James Bond, they're all gone. It's back to the basics. He's got to rely on his skill, his expertise, and his experience. And you know what? Those don't even exist for him in this movie because he fails all his tests. He is not cleared for duty. So last week in the Back to the Future episode, I talked about the tests that a hero is faced with in the middle build. So this is Act 2 of a 3-act story. In Skyfall, Bond is faced with tests as soon as the middle build begins. They're literal tests here. MI6 is assessing whether he can go back in the field.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it, that he fails them all, but doesn't know until later. So it's about the psychological knowledge of knowing whether you've failed or not. And sometimes if you don't know, you can still go on and do the things that you always used to do. It's a really interesting plot device, isn't it? Because I think in a lot of the hero's journey stories, you are meant to fail a lot of the tests. You are meant to learn from those points of failure. And I do think it's key in this movie because Bond isn't at his peak physically, but this is where experience and knowledge, so the mental agility that he needs to outsmart Silver, is set up. I think it's important and, like you said, a very clever way that the writers worked it into the story for him.
Okay, now before I ramble on too much, let's take a look at the act breakdown. And again, these are rough numbers. So the movie is about 2 hours and 20 minutes long, which is a long movie, but there's some really long action sequences, and that sort of pushes it over the 2-hour limit. The beginning hook is about 18% of the story. The ending payoff is about 22% of the story. The middle is 60%. So it's over half of the movie. Now, the middle of the movie starts when Bond shows up at M's apartment after he's been missing and is presumed dead. And it ends when he rescues M from Silva's attack at the Inquiry. Now, what I find interesting about this movie is that the middle of the story is being driven by M's storyline. It's a significant subplot, which, you know, is as it should be because it is Judi Dench after all, and this is her final Bond film. But this is where the storytelling is happening. It's in M's storyline. There's not much of a story going on with Bond. There just isn't. If you pull out just the Bond scenes, you know what they are? Really long action scenes. And they are hitting the conventions of this genre and subgenre, but there's not a lot of story happening there. Now, one problem that I do have, and it might not be an issue with the canon as a whole, it might just be that I don't know the canon well enough. And so this is why it's sticking out to me as something odd. But in storytelling, there is a saying, and it goes like this: nothing new after Act 2. Now, I'm not sure if this is Act 2 in a 3-act structure or Act 2 in a 4-act structure. So far in my study, I've noticed that the vast majority of movies have nothing new happening after the midpoint. So in other words, by the 50% mark of the movie or the novel, we've met all the characters we need to meet and everything has been set up that needs to be set off, because in the second half of the movie, all those setups start to pay off. Now, in Skyfall, we meet a new character in the ending payoff, the final act of the story, and that's the groundskeeper played by Albert Finney. The only function he fulfills in this particular movie is to deliver exposition. He tells James that the house is sold and that the gun collection is sold. He doesn't really add any other value. I mean, he doesn't really help them prepare for Silva. I mean, it is M and 007. They can take care of themselves. There isn't anything that a groundskeeper can do that they can't do themselves better and faster. We also don't know who this is, so therefore we don't particularly care about him. And there's no time to develop his character or develop a relationship between him and 007. He doesn't move the story forward. So the question I had was, why is he in the movie? Now, after listening to Melanie, I have an idea, and it might be that he is the father figure. So if we're looking at M as the mother figure, then in the ending payoff, we have this elderly, quote unquote, couple who's like ma and pa, and James Bond is the son who's going to save the two of them. Honestly, I think that's really pushing it for a Bond movie. It is Albert Finney, and it was great to see him on screen, but why? Other than delivering the exposition, what does he do? Yes, he helps get M to safety, but it's M. M is not a doddering old lady, and that's what they've made her in this movie. M is M. She's the boss. She didn't get to where she is by being a doddery old lady. She's made of tough stuff. So the reason I'm saying maybe this makes sense if you know the whole Bond canon, because it's possible that this is a character that was introduced in one of the other films, and I just don't know about it because I'm not that versed in it. And if that's the case, and there's already a relationship with him that has been developed and the audience already knows him, then his appearance in the ending payoff might be a callback. And maybe that's really enjoyable for Bond fans. Maybe it's like a nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But if he just sort of appears, then I'm confused. It confused me. I thought, who's this guy? Where did he come from? It's not a Deus Ex Machina, because the groundskeeper is he's not the guy who comes in, who swoops in and saves the day. If he was, this would be a Deus Ex Machina. This is just like a character that appears, and it almost feels like in the editing room, all his scenes earlier in the movie got cut or something. And they couldn't afford to refilm all the scenes because they'd already burnt down Skyfall. And so there he is in the end. I'm being a bit facetious, but not much. All right. As we go into the middle build, that is the extraordinary world in the hero's journey, right? So how is this an extraordinary world for Bond? Now, the idea here for every writer, every genre, if you're writing a hero's journey, arc, plot, story, the idea is to show that the extraordinary world is very different from the ordinary world. We want to show that this character is out of his element. And sometimes the extraordinary world is a different physical location. You know, there's a new house, a new city, a new imaginary world, something. They go through the looking glass or whatever. Last week with Back to the Future, we saw the extraordinary world as a different time period. So the same physical place, but a different time period. But the extraordinary world can also be just a brand new situation or a new experience. So in Gone Girl, for example, Nick goes into the extraordinary world when he is, after Amy goes missing, when he's the subject of the investigation. I think they even then go into the police station. So that's sort of him crossing the threshold into the extraordinary world, because he might be an arsehole, but he doesn't go around killing people. He's not someone who gets in trouble with the law and is at the police station all the time. So he's out of his depth there. Still in the same city, still in the same time period, but it's a whole new ball of wax. That's kind of the situation we have here for Bond. Bond's extraordinary world is one where he has been stripped of all the finery, all the bondiness that we see in in other movies, right? And we talked about this a little bit already. He's lost his apartment, all his possessions. His Aston Martin isn't there. He's lost his physical prowess because he's injured. He's lost his ability to shoot. He's not a marksman anymore. And his state of mind is not his ordinary state of mind either. Like his head is just not in the game here. So he's got to go out on a mission with nothing really, or not very much, except raw courage. He is not the slick James Bond that he usually is. Now, of course, they haven't stripped him of all his Bondiness, because then that's not a fun movie for us to watch. He does get some nice suits back. He's hardly decrepit. You know, for my money, watching Daniel Craig run is much better than watching Tom Cruise run. I think Daniel Craig wins. And if you're not a runner, trust me, it's really hard to look good running. Extremely hard to look good running. Bond still gets the girl. I mean, he is 007 after all. So even though he's not at the top of his game, he's still way better than the average bear. So typically, the hero is like a fish out of water in the extraordinary world. But when it comes to Bond, it feels more like he's a guy who's doing this job with one arm tied behind his back. He's got a bit of a handicap, but he's still James Bond. Alrighty. If we look at the middle of a story as Act 2, we can break it in half and we end up with the first half and then a midpoint shift and then the second half. All right, good. In the first half, this is where the tests, allies, and enemy bit of the hero's journey comes in. I talked a lot about that last week. And in Skyfall, it's really clear. It's really obvious. In this section of the story, this is also where the hero gathers any tools he might need. He gets information he might need to know later on. He gathers people or a tribe around him. Whatever it is he's going to need to thwart the villain at the end, this is when he gathers it. And of course, we see Q giving him the gadget. He meets the Bond girl and has sex with her. There's cheesy dialogue. There's always got to be cheesy dialogue in Bond. Like in the shower scene, he says, "I like you better without your Beretta." And her reply is, "I feel naked without it." Like, oh, it's painfully bad dialogue. You know, I did roll my eyes when they said that. I have to be honest. He's flirting with Moneypenny. Melanie, you talked about this. This is all standard James Bond 101 stuff. Also in this section, in this first half of the middle build, Bond uses both of the tools that Q gave him. So all those were both setups that are paid off before the middle build. And this is also where M's storyline is unfolding. We're getting a lot of good stuff going on here. Then we have the midpoint shift. And this is when Silva enters the story. And it's right at the 50% mark. It's been set up well, and it shows how right M is. And remember, M is also the one who is saying that in a world of high tech, we've got to rely on good old-fashioned spy work. M said that the villain was one of them. She said that they had come from the shadows, just like 007, and in this scene, we see that she's right. She's smarter than all those guys. In the second half of Act 2, this is when the hero is flying by the seat of his pants. He's just trying to keep his head above water. The villain is in control here, and the hero is reacting. Now, this is certainly what happens when Silva breaks out of confinement. He's in charge here. Bond and Q are scrambling to keep up. Again, we see that tech is not up to the task. Silva was able to hack it, and Q can't track him fast enough with the tech. Again, we see a need for a man in the field. Now, what I found most interesting about this part of the movie is the way they cross-cut the scenes between Q and headquarters, Bond chasing Silva, and M at the inquiry. Now, why would they do this? Well, this whole sequence starts with Q trying to crack the code, and there is nothing less interesting to watch on screen than a guy tapping on a computer. He's not even typing properly. When they show close-ups of the hands, it kind of drives me a bit crazy. He's just randomly tapping keys. I'm a typist, can you tell? And that's what Q is doing. That's what's happening there, right? There's nothing physically to watch because all of the tension and all of the real action is happening in Q's head. So they got to jazz it up somehow, right? So they use the fancy graphics on the big screens, and then they cross-cut to other scenes that have a bit more oomph to them. Now, cross-cutting isn't something that novelists can really do quite as well. I mean, it can be done. I've seen it done. It's a lot harder to pull off. It is not for the faint of heart. But then, on the flip side, a novelist can go right into Q's head and mine the tension and the action that's going right on in there. Before I finish, I just want to say a quick note about pacing and the importance of knowing your genre. In this movie, there are an awful lot of really long action scenes. Just 4 very quick examples. There's the shooting scene where Bond follows Patrice to Shanghai, and this is where he meets the Bond girl. That's 7 minutes. There's the casino scene, and there we get to see the martini being shaken, right? And the gun is paid off. That's 10 minutes. The midpoint shift scene with Silva, I got tired of timing them. They were just so long. I kept walking away and coming back, to be perfectly honest. And then the final chase scene, I mean, that goes on forever. That just goes on. That's most of the second half of the middle. So, I found them uninteresting. I was kind of bored with them, but then admittedly, I am not the target audience for this movie. I personally thought that they slowed the pace. However, I am willing to bet that these are exactly the scenes that fans of James Bond movies loved. And this is what they're paying their money for. So of course they're going to have these big action scenes in a James Bond movie. And this is a really important lesson for us. We have to understand exactly what it is we're writing. We have to understand not only the genre, but the subgenre. And we have to know what the fans of that genre and subgenre are going to expect so that we can deliver on it. Like, no one is ever going to ask me to write a James Bond film because I don't get it. I think Skyfall provides everything that a fan of James Bond movies would want. It's structurally sound, and it has the added bonus of giving Emma a storyline that Judi Dench can do something with. They took this idea that technology cannot replace real people on the ground with real-world experience, and they ran with it. And you know what? That applies to our lives. It applies to us as writers as well. AI will never write a story as well as a human can because AI will never have real-world experience. It'll never get its heart broken. It'll never suffer loss. It'll never celebrate success. It doesn't feel anything, and we do, and that is where stories come from. Whew. Okay, Melanie, this is a marathon episode. What do you have for the action step this week?
All right, today's action step is fairly simple. I'd like you to attempt to write a small scene of dialogue between 2 people where they say one thing but mean another. It can use euphemisms, like the example I gave between Em and Valerie, or it could be a conversation filled with innuendo, like Bond and Moneypenny's conversation. So it's a fun thing to do, and it's another skill you can put in your writing utility belt.
That wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Groundhog Day. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and help us spread the word by telling your writer friends about us. And please feel free to like and share our social media posts. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow me on Twitter and Instagram @Valerie_Francis. And if you'd like to find out more about Melanie, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit her on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.